Yo, and welcome to Shooting the Soil. Lilu looks ready for this early September tour of the garden, so let's roll the intro and get right into it. Okay, so starting off, we transitioned this old bed that nothing really worked well into a sunchoke bed, also known as Jerusalem artichokes. And it's very true that the deer love these. Even though I put this wire around it, they have chomped them down all year long. And then this area, I decided to just let it go wild this year. We got our close to 30-year-old chive plant here that just comes back every year. Then over here to the left, we have our mint that's just taken over, going to flower now, and the pollinators have been absolutely loving this whole area. I didn't add a single thing to this whole area, nor did I ever have to water it. Now, before we get into the main lazy, weedy, regenerative garden, let's go over what we've done this year, as we check out those pollinators. The only thing we purchased this year was a mycorrhizal inoculant from AEA called Nemesis. At the beginning of the season, we only had enough homemade compost to maybe put down 1/4 of an inch throughout the whole garden. And other than that, we did 2 compost extracts towards the beginning of the season and 1 JMS towards the middle of the season. So basically, this year, we really tried to push and test to see how little we can do in a regenerative system that's only been advancing in succession for 2 years. With that being said, onward and into the garden. First off, we have one of my pawpaws that's looking super healthy. It spent its first winter outside. It's 2 years old, starting to really thrive because I think the roots are now deep enough to get down to the 30-inch striped bass I stuck in the ground before planting. Up here is my elderberry, which I just harvested a whole bunch of berries off of before the birds got them. The area below, there used to be an old shed. So I've been working on remediating this area by letting it grow wild, removing the plant matter, and then replacing that with clean organic matter and composting it in place, just in case any heavy metals leaked into the soil. Over here, we grew some sorghum for the first time. If you have not already, you should definitely check out the video where I show you how I saved this sorghum from a fungal pathogen. Link in the description below. The gist of it is, we managed to outcompete the pathogen with beneficial fungi and some LAB. In this bed, we have some atomic tomatoes from Baker Creek Seeds, and I really enjoyed these tomatoes this year. The small ones down here I just planted at the end of August, and the big one that's on its way out was planted at the beginning of the season. I really like these sized tomatoes, especially for the lazy gardener, because you could just pick what you need when you need it and use it fresh, as opposed to a large tomato where you use 2 slices for a sandwich and then have to store the rest in the fridge. Next is my new sweet potato bed I built this year. Sweet potatoes are doing really well. Also stuck a few carrots down in this end since it's a nice new loose soil, as well as intercropping in some Simpson lettuce and a bit of arugula. I figured it was clever to have the edible sweet potato leaves planted right next to my salad greens. But what I found to be really interesting is that I've always had a lot of insect pressure on my leafy greens. But this year, as you can see, the insect pressure is only on the sweet potato leaves. So I'm definitely going to continue planting these two together. And I can't wait to see what I have for a sweet potato yield down there. Okay, now we move on to the strawberry bed. One of my favorite things to grow in the garden because they just taste so much better than the ones you usually find at the store. as well as producing all year long and just being that easy to harvest, tasty snack every time you walk into the garden. And here is probably my biggest success of the season is I finally got 1,500-year-old cave beans, also from Baker Creek Seeds, to absolutely thrive this year. And just look at all the beans we have hanging off of just these few couple of plants. Last year, I tried growing these down in that lower, wetter bed where the sunchokes are growing, and barely got enough beans to save and grow these beans. So it seems I may have adapted the bean to grow better in my climate. Or it just likes the conditions of this higher, drier bed. Likely a bit of both. Here are the purple bumblebee tomatoes. They were planted too early this spring, and the plants never really bushed up, but we still got a pretty decent harvest out of them. And over here to the right, we have some dragon tongue beans. We just planted them at the end of August. Here is the first run that I had this year of dragon tongue beans before the summer heat took them out. Even though the plants didn't get that big, every plant still produced 4 to 6 large full bean pods. A good example of vegetative growth not necessarily translating into reproductive growth. I'll get into some reasons of why I think my vegetative growth was under par in this bed this year. For instance, here we have a volunteer squash that grew about this big in less than a month in spring, stayed the same size, and only produced this one little whatever it is. I got a few cucumbers from these Boston pickling cucumbers, but again, not as vigorous as I would have liked them. I lost a few to blossom rot, and I really think they could have benefited from a few foliar sprays. So yeah, between being really busy this summer and focusing on that sorghum and providing that content, we sort of neglected some things. But over here, the sweet peas are doing really good in their second run this year. Just planted some Valhalla Rowing Onions over here. Very excited for these. Check out Garden Like a Viking's YouTube channel. Link in the description, and I'd highly recommend getting yourself some because look how vigorous and how big they've gotten in just 3.5 weeks. Okay, and now on to the issues that I'm having in this bed. This corn here sprouted up healthy in the spring, grew to about this height, and then really just gave up, and then was sort of affected by the same fungal pathogen that the sorghum was. And you can see we have a really poor and small root structure here. Despite the soil being this dark, healthy looking color and looking decent under the microscope, as well as the chemical soil analysis showing more than adequate nutrients. So let's dig down and find out why these roots are not growing. And what I found is all these large roots growing into the bed from outside of the garden. Pretty much dominating the root zone, crisscrossing every which way, and even matting the soil with all these little feeder roots in some places. Here is another root that I basically pulled out of the same place right after. Now, don't get me wrong. As you can see from my garden, I'm a big fan of companion and indicator plants, other words known as weeds, but these roots are a whole different ballgame. So I took the time to trace the root, since we are right here on the side of the forest, to see what species it might be, and sure enough, it is my arch nemesis species on the property. Can you spot this invasive species before I point it out? The leaves look very similar to this native honeysuckle, but it grows more like a bush. Right next to it, we have this little vine, which is the culprit. You can identify the young vines by this dark red, somewhat orange color. And it is called Japanese bittersweet. And it is by far the worst invasive species I have encountered. Here is what the vine looks like when it's large, and you can see it's wrapping itself around this tree, girdling it, choking it out, and would eventually kill it. And here is what it does to the understory of the forest. Just growing vines everywhere and totally dominating, just like it did with its roots in the soil of my garden, and also took over my compost last year. So unfortunately, it's looking like we're going to have to till this whole bed. but that gives us a perfect opportunity to do a video on proper tillage and how to protect the soil and prevent the loss of nutrients through oxidization. So stay tuned for that. Hit those buttons if you would be so kind, and we'll catch you on the next one.